We routinely hear media pundits and celebrities vocalize the popular notion that reservations have encouraged an environment of mediocrity. Middle-class Indians frequently lament about the unfairness of the reservation policy and attribute to it a litany of perceived national problems ranging from inefficiency of India's bureaucracy to the poor quality of its medical services to the incompetence of its engineering graduates. A nation that persistently compromises on merit cannot compete at the global level. This is the argument of many members of India's prestigious IITs and IIMs who insist that they are institutes of excellence and hence must be exempted from reservations. They explain the lack of representation of minorities and OBCs in their faculty by emphasizing the focus on merit in their selection. There's widespread support for the view that merit should be the sole selection yardstick for access to top schools and jobs. Proponents of caste-blind approach insist that it is the only way for India to break out of the shackles of centuries-old pernicious caste divisions. By designating certain castes as backward, we are perpetuating the existing distinctions on the basis of caste. If the aim of reservations is to make up for socioeconomic differences, then those differences should be the basis of the reservation policy, not caste. This would help end the continued presence of caste in public discourse and allow more targeted allocation of reservation benefits to those who actually deserve them, as opposed to the creamy layer among the oppressed castes who tend to be repeated beneficiaries of India's affirmative action policies. Further, the historically privileged classes cannot be expected to atone for the sins of their ancestors till perpetuity. Reservation policies have been in force for over 70 years and even longer in some parts of India. Generations of students and job applicants have experienced utter frustration at seeing their hard-earned positions being denied to them and allocated to those who scored less than them in competitive exams. Isn't this reverse discrimination? To examine the veracity of these popular notions from an economic standpoint, we have with us Dr. Ashwini Deshpande, who is a renowned economist and professor of economics at Ashoka University. She's well known for her papers concerning various topics such as poverty, inequality, regional disparities, and gender discrimination. She's the author of The Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India, Globalization and Development, a Handbook of New Perspectives, and The Global Economic Crisis and the Developing World. Ma'am, welcome to Argumentative Indians. It's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me. And you missed actually the name of the book that's the most relevant to today's session, which is a short book called The Affirmative Action in India. It's a part of the Oxford India Short Introduction series. It's been written for the interested layperson, not an academic necessarily. So a lot, this time is short and I will not be able to say a lot in this session. So I encourage everybody to read the book, which outlines my arguments more substantively.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing us to that. So to begin with this conversation about reservation policy, I think it's important to understand why do we have the reservation policies? Is the goal to, we are all aware that historically there were a lot of injustices done to certain social groups, but is the goal of the reservation policy to right those historical wrongs and the people who are not part of those groups, are we now paying for the injustices done by our ancestors?
That's only a very small part of the rationale. The aim of the reservation policy, as I see it, is it desegregates what used to be elite positions in the Indian society and economy. So immediately after independence, the public sector took the lead in terms of the nation building. So government jobs were the most coveted jobs, and development was led by the government or the state, not by the private sector. So at that point, to reserve certain seats in government employment, government-led educational institutions, these were the primary, these were the very highly coveted positions. Today, India has changed, and the private sector plays a much bigger role in India's economic development, including in education. In fact, the university where I am at now is a private university, and the private sector is completely exempt from reservations. So when we criticize reservations, we overestimate the spread of reservations. So first, I think we have to understand is that reservations are not as widespread as we think they are. Second point is that correcting for historical injustices is only a very tiny part of the exercise. As I said, to my mind, it desegregates the composition of elite positions. So when you take IAS or IFS officers or engineers that are trained out of government institutions, lawyers, et cetera, professors, journalists, all these individuals who are trained out of government run institutions, they are much more diverse in their composition than if there were no reservation, because reservation gives access to individuals to these positions who would otherwise not have access. And the third thing is that it would be completely wrong for us to believe that discrimination and injustice based upon caste identity is a matter of history. It's a matter of the past. It isn't. It gets reinforced and replicated in contemporary times every single day. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just scan today's newspapers, yesterday's newspapers, and show me a month in the post-independence period where there has been no mention of any caste-based atrocity anywhere in the country.
But
so we should not think, and this is just atrocities. And I work on discrimination, so I can talk about that later. But I think that to believe that this was some injustice done in the past, and why should we be paying a price for it? Well, guess what? It is done in the present.
So a lot of people who oppose caste-based reservations, they tend to argue that it is these reservations that have still kept caste alive and relevant today. Instead of addressing, reducing the disparities, it has actually reinforced these caste identities and reinforced the notion that certain communities are backward. And because of these reservations, the others who feel like they are losing opportunities to them because of the reservation policy, it creates a resentment. So it is actually dividing the society instead of bringing us together. What's your view on that?
So there are several layers to this argument, and I'm very well aware of this argument. Of course, it's not new and it's very widespread. So I don't deny or dispute the fact that these policies are resented, right? But resentment can be a valid resentment, or a resentment can be an invalid resentment. Just because something is resented doesn't make it invalid. So that's point number one. Point number two is that when society is composed of different units, forget about caste for a minute, think of men and women, right? Our society, as all societies are, Indian societies also consist of men and women. Supposing you were to take the view that even if women are hardly represented in jobs, in education, in decision-making positions, it really doesn't matter. And if you talk about increasing representation of women, it is actually a divisive move. Would people agree with that? Maybe some people would agree with that. But most people would say, no, if women live in this society, and if decisions that get taken impact women's lives, then women also have a role to play in decision-making. I think most people listening to this seminar today, I hope most people listening to this seminar today would agree with that kind of a view. So society is always composed, all societies are composed of heterogeneous units, be they caste groups, be they gender groups, be they religious groups, be they linguistic groups, etc. In the United States, we have racial groups. And many Indians, very proudly proclaim on Twitter, etc., Black Lives Matter. Why? Why is it that when Blacks in the United States and then injustice done to Blacks, and we react very sympathetically? Because we believe Blacks have as much right to be citizens, equal citizens of the United States as whites have. Now think about the same logic about all different diverse, India is a very diverse country. And to have a set of policies that provide representation to a wider base of people as opposed to a narrower base of people, to my view, is always a good idea.
Let me see if I can capture the view of the people who post Black Lives Matter on their social media, but then tend to resent a lot of the reservation policy. A lot of these people tend to consider themselves casteless. That I don't believe in caste politics. I don't care. I don't even know what my caste is. I'm not interested in any of this. And I've never asserted my caste to claim any benefits. So how do I have a competitive edge over others? I just compete on merit. I work hard and I track the exams and I get my, so
Sure.
A lot of these people. So actually, can you tell me what kind of competitive edge, like what kind of disparities that are still out there that these people are not aware of?
Well, I'll talk about the disparities in a minute, but let's unpack the arguments that you just make, right? Now, if you talk to, I can ask you, you're a man, do you continuously, do you get harassed, sexually groped when you travel in very crowded metros or buses? Do you get groped on the streets? Do women make catcalls at you when you are walking on the street? Do your parents tell you, please, beta, come back by 7 o'clock because it's going to get dark outside and it's not safe for you? Are there comments on what you wear? Are your friends as scrutinized as your sister's friends are, for example? So think about all these things. So when you talk about gender discrimination that women face, and if you asked a man, did you face that kind of gender discrimination? The answer is going to be no. But why? Because those individuals are not women, right? And so individuals who say that I have never felt the impact of belonging to a particular caste, would it not be unreasonable to imagine that they perhaps lie on the end of the caste spectrum that is not stigmatized, that is not disadvantaged? How likely is it that a child who belongs to a jati that is stigmatized on account of untouchability would grow up to say, well, I never felt untouchability. I never felt like I was a child formally untouchable. I mean, untouchability is actually illegal. But if you look at survey data, for example, India Human Development Survey, asked people if they practiced untouchability. It was self-reported. They just had to say yes or no. Do you know what percentage of Indians said that they practice untouchability? 30%. And this is when it's punishable and you can be imprisoned for saying that, right? And so if 30% said it openly, you can only imagine that untouchability the prevalence is even larger. So typically when we talk about racial divisions or gender divisions, people who are at the receiving end, or there's always a dominant group and a subaltern group, a non-dominant group. Groups are seldom have equal power. So when a member of a dominant group claims that, oh, discrimination along this dimension, I don't think that exists because I've never faced it. Well, guess what? That's because you belong to the dominant group. And I'm not using the word caste deliberately because people react very negatively, but what I'm saying, just import that to any other context. And you will see what I'm saying. So that's the one thing. Now, coming to merit and working hard. Let me just finish one more thing, yeah, sure. Which is all those people who say that they don't think about their caste. Every single data point in India shows that 95% of marriages, including urban, very rich kids, 95% of marriages are caste-based, and we have no qualms about putting advertisements for ourselves and seeking partners based upon caste. Why? Why would you do that, right? And if somebody said caste is not an issue, people say, well, what's wrong with you? There must be a catch in this, right? The few ads that come in the matrimonial columns which says caste no bar, people will say, oh, there must be a catch then. There must be some issue, which is why they're seeking out. So marriage is definitely along caste lines. Caste plays a huge role in elections. And my work and the work of many others shows how caste discrimination gets practiced in employment outcomes, in self-employment, in labor market, other outcomes, who gets which job, at what level are they placed, what wages, what salaries they'll get. Caste plays a big role in all of these matters. Finally, merit, right? What we think of as very individual merit, we must be willing to examine the sources of our merits. If we belong to a well-off family, we went to a well-placed private school, we had English language education, our parents are educated, we get to travel, we have libraries, we have access to resources, and we do well in school, that's great. But if we didn't have all these facilities, would we still do as well as we do? It's a question that we must ask ourselves. We don't want to ask ourselves that, because it then shows that maybe we benefited from our socioeconomic circumstances. And what I would like to say to the audience today is that many of us, including myself, we have benefited from the circumstances of birth. We didn't choose to be born into the families that we are born into, but we were lucky that we got born into families with substantial social and economic capital, and we benefit from that. There's no point in saying we don't.
So the socio-economic is pretty obvious to understand, right? Like that, to be born and have access to good primary education, economic opportunities to pay the fees of good schools, and to live in areas where you can easily access good schools, you're not far away in remote areas. But if that is the sole criteria of the disparity, can that not be the basis of these reservation policies? So that's another argument that comes up. Why not make the economic circumstances and apparently there is much less resistance to the economic-based reservations versus caste-based reservations.
Okay, so that's again a very good question, and it comes up very often, which is that if it's just economic gaps, why not just have reservations or any policy for that matter based only upon economic criterion? Well, it isn't just economic gaps. That is the issue. Again, I'll take an example from outside of India, because to appreciate these issues within India, sometimes you have to look outside. So 2 examples. One, there's a very famous story by Barack Obama before he became president. And before his face was so well known as it was. He went to a black tie dinner in Chicago. And he says that people confused him for the valet, because almost everybody in that audience was white. And here was a man who was, of course, dressed as them, but you know that in these very fancy dinners, valets are also dressed, they also have to wear black ties, etc. But just because he was a black man, he was confused for a valet. So just having the wealth did not change people's perceptions of who he was. Not recently, actually, some time back, a professor at Harvard University, considered amongst the best universities in the world, was entering his own home, an African-American professor. Police stopped him because somebody complained that a black man is trying to break into a house, because they didn't imagine that a black man could be actually the owner or the resident of that particular house. Final story. This is also very well known. Everybody can Google it. Oprah Winfrey went to Paris, and she went to these very high-end boutiques, and the sales woman there did not recognize Oprah Winfrey. Right? She saw a black woman, rich, but a black woman, And so Oprah Winfrey asked for a handbag. And the woman said to her, I can show it to you, but it may be a bit out of your reach. Of course, Oprah Winfrey could have bought all the bags in that store and all the stores on that street. She's so rich. But what the French person saw was just a rich black woman. But, her point is, if a black woman is rich, how rich can she be? So she was, and then of course it became a huge issue and, very embarrassing, because Oprah at that time was, I think, the richest person in the entertainment industry in the United States. So she was super rich. My point being that just climbing up the economic ladder does not change stigmatizing attitudes. Now, how is this relevant for India? Because untouchability, which arises out of caste-based occupations that are considered very dirty, very polluting. So, manual scavenging, cleaning, working with leather, etc., etc. Individuals belonging to these families, even when they have left that occupation, they are, middle class or, professional, and you may not be able to see it on their faces. When people figure out that their originally belonged to a caste that was considered untouchable, the attitude completely changes. Again, you don't have to take my word for it. Read a brilliant book by Yashika Dutt called Coming Out as Dalit. She and her family did not reveal to their community, I mean, to the people they knew, that they were Dalits because they were educated, they were English speaking, middle class jobs, etc. And at one point, in the book, she talks about it, that she decided to reveal on national television that she was, a Dalit. And that was very embarrassing because the parents hadn't told anybody. So it was but now she says, why should I be ashamed of the fact?
Yeah.
But many people broke off relations. So belonging to a stigmatizing, belonging to a caste that was originally engaged in stigmatizing occupations leaves a scar of stigma even today. Let that scar go, then we can talk about it.
So basically you're saying is that there are all these pre-existing stereotypes. We don't expect certain communities to be represented as academics or scholars. They have many of them. So the only way these stereotypes can change is when they start breaking through that ceiling and we start seeing their representation. Exactly. By just not talking about it, the stereotype's not going to go because their representation is not going to be there. But here's the next question that comes up right after that. So let's say you get two people of different people in the different points of social hierarchy, and help one which is starting at who has a disadvantage. So you help that person and get both of them into a competitive exam. Let's say you get them both into an engineering college or medical college. After that, there is another level of preference there at the job level, and then sometimes even at the promotion level. So why is that needed? Haven't you brought them on the even footing now? Why do you need to give the continued support?
Yeah, I would really want us to reach a situation where once you give support at one level, there should not be any subsequent discrimination. That is my wish too. The question is, I think this is where evidence comes in. So I feel that if there is no evidence of labor market discrimination between students who have graduated from, let's say, a good university or a good school, right? And they go onto the labor market and the labor market doesn't treat them differently, then absolutely there's no reason to have reservations in jobs. But what if the evidence points otherwise? What if the evidence shows that over and above all the past discrimination, when individuals enter the job market, there is fresh discrimination in the job market, which is not related to education levels? What then? I'm not saying reservation is the only answer, but then we have to think of a policy that will address that discrimination at that level. My point is that if there's discrimination present at different levels, we have to think of policies that will address discrimination at all those different levels. The issue is, Yajur, that communities get used to being in power or being in privilege. And when people are asked to share space that they had earlier not shared with a group of individuals that they, in their minds, think are inferior to them, that always creates a problem. It's not just in India. So when individuals are asked to share space with people they consider lower down in socioeconomic hierarchy, that's a problem. But that's what creates a resentment. But as I said earlier, resentment can be a valid resentment. A resentment can be an invalid resentment. And we have to think of, so if we want a casteless, or we want a society where caste should not play a role, if that is what we want, then this resentment is invalid. Because then all Indians are equal, right?
Right, yeah.
So exactly. whether your classmate is a Brahmin or Dalit, or it should not matter, right? But if it matters to you, then in fact, we are not heading towards a casteless society.
And yet we see that like there are certain groups who tend to dominate sectors, right? Like, for example, I think a study was done a few years ago which showed that IITs and IIMs, all the faculty is dominated by only 20% of India's caste groups. Like 20% of them dominate pretty much 90% of all the positions there. And so the question is like, have certain groups monopolized these institutions, or are they just actually more meritocratic, which is probably what they want to believe? So I want to ask, do you find labor market discrimination in private sector as well?
Of course. But the issue is that because private sector doesn't have, so here is one of the, one of the sort of complications of the reservation policy. So reservations are applicable only in the public sector, right? So that means when somebody applies to a public sector job, they have to tick a box, SC, ST, etc. Right? That's what they have to do. But in the private sector, there is no reservation. So when an individual applies to a position, they don't have to tick any box if there is a form at all, right? Therefore, the caste-wise data on private sector employees is virtually non-existent. So we don't know, honestly speaking. And many years ago, I think 2007, after Manmohan Singh had appealed to the chambers of commerce and industry, ASSOCHAM, FICCI, etc., to say, private sector must play a role in addressing caste inequality. So the point is, we don't know what the level of caste inequality is in the private sector because we don't have this data that you have in the public sector. So ASSOCHAM, FICCI, etc., made a code of conduct and they sent out questionnaires to their member organizations to say, could you do a survey within your own firms and find out, where the representation is. 95% of the members didn't even turn the survey back in. Right? So, because they said, we don't want to think about caste, right? So that's that. The other question is that in the private sector, which, something that we know, but we don't talk about, is that in the private sector, several of the jobs are never advertised. Unlike in the government job, it has to be advertised, there has to be clear-cut criteria about who gets selected, who doesn't get selected, etc. Many jobs are filled by networks, through networks. I want somebody, I will tell you, Yajur, do you have somebody with meeting this criteria? I run a company, you will say yes or no or whatever. So a lot of positions get filled through networks. So one of my papers, we asked the students about what, their job market experiences. And what we find in that paper is that often who you know is more important than what you know. It's not about merit, it's about contacts, right? You'd look at the topmost corporate sector in India, family-based firms, whether it's Reliance or anyone else. Who's the next generation of leaders in that firm? It's the children of the earlier generation, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I can confirm to this from my own industry. I worked for over a decade in investment banking. Usually after I accept a position, the job is confirmed, then they will go out and put an ad on public forums, which is just to check the boxes and do the formality. They already know who they're going to hire. It's always through networks. And to your point, people of underprivileged communities just don't have a very well-placed network. They just don't have that many lawyers and academics and others in their network, and bankers and all. So that is understood. But I don't expect any kind of institutional discrimination in the MNCs, which are becoming a greater and greater share of Indian job market, right? When some firms are coming in from the United States and UK and all, obviously they don't care about what castes, backgrounds people are. But your point is that the people who are making the hiring decisions are local people, and they have their own notions about who fits the profile of a manager or an accountant. So certain groups, certain names and certain groups probably suit more.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what happens. It doesn't matter what the company is. The actual hiring is being done by locals, right? And many of the times it's not, sometimes the discrimination can be active, but sometimes it's passive in the sense that you really believe that you're hiring the best person for the job. It just happens to be the case that you also think that, let's say, a Tamilian Brahmin is the most that community is very meritorious. So you think you're hiring the best person, and that person might be genuinely good. Nothing against a particular individual being hired. But it's just that you already made up your mind to look for people within certain communities. And now there's evidence, HR managers interviews, where they talk about how they figure out who the best person for the job is. And then the stereotypes come into play. And groups that are negatively stereotyped lose out in this assessment. So stereotypes replace our notions of merit. And what we often think of as merit is actually just a stereotype.
You know,
And
I
that's
think there's
unfair. That's not meritocracy at all. That's the opposite of meritocracy.
so let's talk about meritocracy. So we've talked, you basically say, so far you've kind of made it clear that we want diversity, and you gave the example of why we want to have women representation. There are equal number of women and men in the country. And I think it makes a lot of sense in the political representation sphere, where we started off with one person, one vote and all of that. And you also clarified that why certain people are at a natural disadvantage. So it would be basically creating an equal opportunity for them by giving them the reservation, affirmative action support. But now I want to come to the question of merit. Is merit getting compromised by doing that? Like when we talk about institutions like, so IITs and IIMs, they claim that like you need a higher level of professional skill and expertise that cannot be compromised on. Otherwise, the credibility of the institution is at stake. And similarly, people also argue that at an admission level, that if you bring in a lot of students who are not as qualified as the others, they are going to struggle, and they are going to either bring down the level of the class, or they're more likely to drop out. So you're not really doing them a service. Plus, you are adversely affecting the credibility of the degree itself, if a lot of people end up being incompetent engineers or doctors. And then you get, and a very common question is, would you ever risk a pilot who's got in with a quota? Would you ever fly a plane? Or would you like let a surgeon do your surgery if he has come through a quota? So like, how do we address the question of merit? And I think this is something that even the courts have commented upon in India in various judgments, that certain things should be kept, like considerations of efficiency need to be made when we are deciding on reservation policy.
Yeah, let's start. A very good question, and you've summed it up really well. Let's start with the last bit, where do I want an incompetent surgeon, or do I want an incompetent pilot? Do I want to take my car on a bridge that might collapse because it was built by an incompetent engineer? And the answer to all this is no, of course not. I want a competent doctor. I want a competent pilot. I don't want to die because some incompetent person messed up. Question is, how do I know who's competent? Now, how do I know that an upper caste surgeon who's doing my surgery didn't get into the medical school through a management quota? Do I have any way of finding that out? At least in the case of the SC/ST quota, the cutoff differences are publicly known, right? So first of all, this was what I was teaching in my class yesterday, which is that unlike popular mythology against reservations, not everybody just walking on the street can enter a medical college and an engineering college. There is a minimum eligibility which everybody must have, whether it's SC/ST or whether it's upper caste. So everybody needs to have a minimum eligibility to enter a particular institution, right? Which means that they have the basic competence. Cutoff is a question of how many people are applying and how many positions are there, right? And there, if for a fixed number of positions, if a lot of people apply, you're going to have a higher cutoff. If a fixed number of positions, fewer people apply, the cutoff is going to be lower. Now, in the reserved category, also these seats are highly competitive. It's never the case that there are 20 reserved seats and 20 people are eligible, and so all 20 walk in. In IITs and IIMs, there's massive competition. And in medical colleges, there's massive competition for even the reserved category seats. It's just that the cutoff is lower, that is correct. Finally, my electricity is gone. So I'm going to now log on. Maybe can we pause for a minute while I switch devices?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. You can turn off your video for a minute and we can come back.
My laptop my desktop is going to go off in a minute. Yeah.
Sure. So while Dr. Deshpande joins us back again, I just want to tell everybody in the conversation that you can post your questions in the chat section, and I will bring you into the conversation to ask your questions directly to Dr. Deshpande.
Recording in progress.
Yes, so I'm on my phone now. Can you hear
perfect.
me?
Yes, perfect. That was really quick.
Yeah.
I want to bring up the one of the so last year, I believe the Madras court, I think they came out with a verdict on this subject of, I think, promotions that are given based on reservations and promotions in certain jobs. And the court said that, and also on getting in, like, I think there was a petition that would challenge the people getting into through competitive exams. And the court basically said that merit cannot be reduced to the narrow definition of performance in a competitive examination. So and as a former, as an alumnus of IIT, I can say that's kind of true. Enough people like me get through with the competitive exams being the gatekeeper. But then the question is, then what's the point of even having these if they're not telling you anything about the merit?
No, they are telling you, they are selecting people. But what you have to understand is that the reserve category students are those who are getting in through the competitive exams. They are at the top of their category, right? So reservation or any affirmative action policy, by definition, is a kind of a policy that allows entry to individuals who otherwise would not have gotten it. So if some people can get in on their own, then there's no need for reservation. There's no reservation. So the cutoffs are lower for reserve category candidates. There's no doubt about that. The question is, how much damage does the lower cutoff do? I think that's the question we need to be asking. My point is, I would rather have a transparent lower cutoff, which is caste-based and publicly advertised, than some management quota person who knows how much money their father gave to that institution. You know, that person could be the complete dud, but just because the father was rich, you know, he or she or whoever it is, they got in. And I would hate to be under that surgeon's knife for sure. It's just that I have no way of telling, because that person is advantaged by their last names and by their social positions. So when we talk about the merit compromising effects, and by the way, there have been studies, including my own, on railway productivity. There have been studies on performance of IAS officers. There have been studies in engineering colleges. There is no evidence that reservations lower overall productivity or overall efficiency. It is a myth. Individual merit is concerned. Good doctors and there are bad doctors. There are good engineers and there are bad engineers. But there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that all the bad engineers and all the bad doctors are the quota doctors and all the good ones are the non-quota ones.
And I think another point to study.
I mean, I want to see that evidence. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, and I think there would be another thing would be interesting to compare is that if there is any disadvantage of lowering the cutoff, what about the advantage of making the overall institution much more diverse? So when we go to the USB schools, they emphasize a lot on diversity because people coming from different backgrounds bring in different ideas, and that makes a much more holistic experience for everybody, as opposed to like a venue where everybody comes from the same background, kind of repeats the same stuff. So there is really not much of exchange there and not much of eye-opening conversations. So there is also to be compared, like if we have a much more campuses is one thing, much more diverse, but even professionally, like to have much more diversity. If as a patient, I can feel more confident that somebody from who looks like me, talks like me, I might have a much more confidence in sharing my problems with a doctor like that, or they might be much more sympathetic to my situation. So there is also, I guess, needs to be studied, like what are the benefits of bringing more diversity to all these professions.
So that's the immediate benefit. But when you think about, even a bigger benefit, I'll point out, which is one paper points out, which is that when you think of people who got in through reservations and compare their positions in the job market, 5 to 10 years after they've graduated, right? Compare their positions to their parental positions. You see a huge improvement. So it contributes to social mobility. Compare that to individuals who didn't get in because of the quota, right? So if 23 people got in because of the quota, 23 upper caste students didn't get it, right? So they lost out because of reservations. When you look at their situation 10 years later, yes, it's true that they didn't get into that particular institution, but they landed on their feet. They went somewhere else. So 10 years down the line, their employment outcomes are not drastically worse off than their parents. So they've either done better than their parents or they've done just as well. So the cost to those who lost out is insignificant compared to the benefits to those who gain. And in economics, we learn a lot about there's no costless policy. Every policy has a cost and a benefit. And when the benefit is greater than the cost, that's a good policy.
I actually couldn't bond you in the leasing end. So now, you talked about like people benefiting from one generation after another, and that's one of the biggest complaints that comes up when around reservation policy, what they call the creamy layer, who have one generation that takes advantage of these opportunities, so they become economically well off, and then their children are again able to take advantage. So this goes on for generations. And the perception is that these people are undeserving because now they are already on a pretty good footing. So do you see that, first of all, as a problem of the reservation policy that needs to be fixed? Or is that like a pretty small segment of the overall benefit that we attain from the reservation policies?
So it might appear surprising, but it's true that first, the private sector is completely out of the reservation sphere, but in the public sector also, every time there are many first generation beneficiaries. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Second, how many generations of reservation will it take for the stigma to be eliminated? I think we should investigate that. Supposing somebody is a third generation beneficiary, are they openly invited to their upper caste peers' homes? If they decided to marry an upper caste peer, how open would that be? And things like that. I think it's a very good question to ask. And I definitely feel that we need more studies to investigate that. So far, at least, just, I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether somebody who's benefited for, several generations of just having levels of education that are very high. Our parents are well educated, their parents were well educated, their parents were well educated. We don't even know how far back the history of education goes in our families. What if somebody said, okay, now you've studied enough, that's it? Would we say, we'll say no, but we'll continue to, benefit from the advantage of intergenerational advantage of education or wealth or anything else. So at what point should we say, okay, enough of this intergenerational transfer? Supposing you say, okay, let's have an inheritance tax. Why should a grandchild benefit from the wealth that the grandparent made? Forget about caste, just I'm throwing this idea. What do you think the reception to that would be?
A huge backlash. I mean, we work so hard to create a capital that we want to pass on to our generations.
Right. So I think when you talk about intergenerational transfers or putting limits to intergenerational transfers, I think the conversation would become more complicated. I would welcome that conversation, but I don't think people are ready to have it. I don't think people are ready to have that conversation.
So basically, even if their parents had acquired economic capital, they still may lack sufficient cultural and social capital to put them on an even footing.
It's possible, and it's possible that at some point that might change. I'm not saying that it's fixed for life. I hope it is not. I mean, if it were going to be fixed for eternity, that would be a very sad state of affairs. So I hope there's enough social mobility so that eventually we don't even need reservations.
Right. I think that's the risk, right? Like once the interests become entrenched, would people ever let them go? And then do we get to a situation where the groups which are historically privileged, they are down, like they are become the underprivileged groups, and then the pendulum swings the other way.
Yeah, I know that people feel that that's happening, but that's so far. I mean, there's not a shadow of evidence. But all I'm saying is that I think conversations around these topics and gathering of evidence around these topics is very important. What we instead tend to do is to shut down these conversations. So I think I congratulate you on having this session, because I think these conversations are very important to have. I would personally be interested in knowing how many generations of advantage does it take to then say, okay, now we don't need this crutch any longer? And would we be willing to have similar conversations about other forms of advantage? Are we willing to consider all forms of advantage, or why reservation only? Let's open this up to other forms of advantage and say, okay, enough, you can benefit up to this point and no more.
Right.
Or not.
And speaking of time,
maybe not.
The framers of the Constitution had envisioned this as a temporary measure for 10 years. But because of the dynamics of, politics, electoral politics, this has been constantly extended and has become de facto permanent now. So, or at least that's how it seems to a lot of people. So what is basically for a lot of people, we haven't really agreed on any parameters where we feel like now certain goals have been achieved. Let's look at this statistics. We're not even gauging any statistics here. How do we get to a stage where we are like, okay, these are the parameters that have been accomplished, and now we don't need any help. Like we could have something like so much representation in different institutions and others, but we don't even have a mechanism in place.
You're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head. The problem, the issue with this reservation policy is because there's so much antipathy to it, because people really don't want this policy. So there is no evaluating mechanism. I tried to collect data on reserved positions and changes over time. It's virtually impossible to get that data. There is no centralized place. I mean, if there is this data centralized anywhere, we don't have access to it. So if you want a policy to succeed, what would you do? You would start the policy, you would keep monitoring it, but wherever it is weak, you enforce it and you move to the next level. So I feel that any good policy, particularly reservation, must have some self-liquidating features that are not required after some time, but then new ones come in, right? So reservation is giving people entry into into an institution. What about acceptance? What about assimilation? What about actual accommodation and inclusion? We had the death by suicide of Rohit Vemula, which alerted us to the problem of that reservation doesn't solve the problem of inclusion and discrimination inside institutions. So reservation might solve one problem, but there might be another problem now at the next stage. If we want this policy to be successful, we would strengthen the entry point and then move on to the next stage. And then the next stage, etc. Right? Instead, we don't know which seats are getting filled, who are not getting filled, etc. It's a mechanical renewal of the policy. As you say, it's sort of become permanent. But the approach is, okay, if we have reservations, we've done our bit for caste discrimination. That's it. No, nothing else is needed. It's not a magic wand. It's not going to solve a problem just by waving this magic wand of reservation. Much more needs to be done. And surely some aspects of these policies can be retired, but we can only retire them when we feel that the objective has been met. So take Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. If all children going up to class 14 are in school, that objective has been met. Then we move to quality of education and so on. So we have to keep moving forward. But for that, we need to be committed to the policy in the first place. We should want to make it succeed.
Do you think educating school children on the rationale for this policy could help in addressing this antipathy that tends to come in them once they get into college, and the anti-reservation rhetoric is very easily affects them? Because, I mean, let's be fair, pretty much most of our media constantly pumps out a lot of anti-reservation rhetoric, which sort of appeals to most of their customers. And I think a lot of people start off with those notions that merit is a simple story. You work hard, you get through the competitive exam, you are more deserving than the other person. So that implicitly it sounds very unfair until you have this entire historical context around it. But I feel like we are not taught about this in schools or even in universities. It's something that if somebody is interested, they can dig on their own and make themselves more informed. So perhaps, do you think it could actually be helpful to bring it, get that sense? I mean, I'm just linking this to sort of a lot of discussions going on in the US around teaching children about the disparities at an early age, so that they don't develop the same kind of attitudes that are constantly a problem generation after generation.
By the way, so there's a huge backlash against teaching critical race theory. And
Right.
now the pressures of the white supremacist groups and the right-wing, white Republicans, critical race theory is being actively removed from many of the university and high school curriculum. So their point is, don't upset our children by talking to them about race. Don't upset the white children, basically. So there would be backlash. But I think you're absolutely right. Not just we talking to the school children, but talking to teachers. There's so much evidence that a lot of discrimination at the school level gets perpetuated by teachers. There are instances of midday meals, upper caste children not eating midday meal schemes if a Dalit cook is employed. Families say that you cannot employ a Dalit helper to cook the midday meal scheme, otherwise our children are not going to eat there. Or inside schools, Dalit children are made to sit at the end. There's a lot of documentary evidence. But, as you said, we need to think of this as a problem. Then, and this is not a reservation problem, but reservation anyway is a tiny, tiny, tiny component of a wider set of solutions that will address caste inequality. But I think we need to recognize and be willing to fight caste inequality as a problem and say, this is not acceptable. And we will not, India wants to be a modern competitive nation. And for that, it's not, having caste inequality is not compatible with that goal. But that's absolutely the approach that we need to have. You're right.
Yeah, and no progress has actually been made without a backlash, right? Any privileged group that stands to lose their privileges is likely to have this backlash. So I think every single thing, every progress for women, every progress for disability people has always come with this kind of a backlash. So that doesn't, but at least we need to start having that conversation, I think, about teaching people about these historical disadvantages that such a large portion of our population has experienced. I want to quickly get to private sector. Like, I want to understand from you. So since 1990s, private sector has become a bigger and bigger part of our of the public life, right? Like, whether it's education institutions, Ashoka, obviously one of the premium schools, is private in India now, but also the job employment, the government jobs are not that coveted anymore. So how is this working out for our long-standing policy of bringing down disparities? Do you think the fact that McKinsey's and all these companies, Standard Charters, are agnostic to Indian caste identities, is that helping in reducing disparities? Or because they are using this caste blind approach, it is actually they're having much more concentrated workforces from the same kind of background?
So that's what I'm saying, that we don't know that. I mean, the thing is that being caste agnostic or caste blind in general is not a good idea. And about Ashoka, since you mentioned it, all I can say is that the admissions team has a very complicated set of metrics where they consider disadvantage along many dimensions. And they are trying to make sure that the student mix is as diverse as possible, given the varieties of diversity, disadvantages in Indian society. So they look at, there's no reservation, that's true. But each individual is assessed along a metric that assesses disadvantage along several dimensions. So that's that. So, but at least there is recognition that there is disadvantage in India along social identity, and that disadvantage should be rectified in terms of representation. So diversity and inclusion is a very stated part of Ashoka's admission policy, right? So obviously everybody can do better. And so, that's that. But diversity and inclusion is not brushed under the carpet at all. As far as other big corporate players are concerned, I hope that's the case with them, but I'm not sure about that. I think that the Indian corporate sector needs to step up and recognize the importance of diversity and inclusion along multiple dimensions, gender dimension, caste dimension, and so on. And we are not seeing enough of either a public statement or, actionable policies that here's our workforce diversity checks, or, you can have, there are all these toolkits that ILO has brought out where you can check your employees' diversity, etc., etc. So, but before we do any of those things, we at least need to recognize that diversity is an important goal in a way that Ashoka has recognized, So I think that we need to make much more progress on that front.
Are you in favor of this voluntary approach by institutions who feel who consciously feel that they need to do something about this, or you would favor the Indian government extending its affirmative policies to the private sector?
I mean, the thing is that because reservation has got such a bad name, the private sector is digging in its heels. I mean, I know that when Manmohan Singh tried in 2007, he did a lot of outreach to the private sector. You know, he spoke to the industry bodies, etc., etc. And their point was no reservations. My point is, okay, fine. Then basically, I'm interested in getting the thing done, right? So I feel like if the diversity angle works, then, but let's make diversity mandatory. So,
like
you know, what I'm saying is
West,
that whether you call it reservation or you think of it as diversity, which is along multiple dimensions. So I myself was a member of, so the government of India had set up a diversity commission in 2008. In the, no, nine, I'm forgetting when. Anyway, some point. And I was a member of that. And we had said that let's include diversity along many spheres and let's apply it across the board to all institutions in the country. Let's not keep it only to the private sector. Because in the US, affirmative action is not applied very widely. But if it is applied, it's applied to both the government as well as the private sector. There's no distinction about that, right? There they don't have quotas, they have preferences, and they have to show that they're equal opportunity employers, etc., etc. So I feel like we need to find creative ways of getting the job done. So if the word reservation or quota is creating a problem, okay, and if that's a wall that can't be broken down, maybe then we think of another word and we think of other strategies. But yes, let's make it mandatory. Yeah, let's make it mandatory. Yeah.
So one trend that's happening in the West right now is that a lot of instead of making it mandatory for companies to do one thing or another, there's a focus on transparency. So companies are being asked to report the diversity in their workforce, in their boards, how many women, how many people of LGBTQ, how many people of disabilities are represented in their workforces. And they're not being penalized by the government, but they're being penalized by social forces, by investors, by consumers. Yeah. And I think that has been achieved through a lot of public discourse, a public dialogue around these subjects and the importance of diversity, which I think needs to be done more in India. Like, we can't just rely on the government to bring about social equality.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the thing is, I think we need to have an eye on the ball. So we want this outcome, you know. So what is, so I always feel like, okay, let's not be mechanical about it. Let's see what are the set of, there's no one policy, by the way, even in the government. I mean, just having reservations is one tiny policy. I know that it's thought of as larger than life, but it isn't really. Honestly, it touches a very tiny segment of the workforce. It touches a very tiny segment of the student community. So we need, even in the public sector, we need much more than reservations. And certainly in the private sector, there's, you know, so I think that we need to be creative. But in order to build the public pressure, as you're saying, there has to be a conversation around it. You know, you can't shut people down because they talk about caste inequality. And unfortunately, that happens far too often, you know. Oh, you're dividing Indian society. No, we are talking about an axis of inequality. That's all we are doing. We're not dividing any. In fact, we want to unite, and therefore we are against inequality.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have actually appropriated these social equality causes for their own political ends, and that has maligned the causes to some extent. And but thanks to the work by experts like you, that the kind of books you're writing and bringing about this kind of awareness, I think that's going to help us move forward. So I'm looking forward to reading your new book, and I am really honored to have you with us. And this was a very enlightening session. Thanks a lot, Dr. Deshpande, for joining us, and we hope you'll join us again in future.
Thank you, Yajur. Fantastic conversation. The book is already out, by the way. It's an old book.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to get my hands over it, and I'll get it signed.
It's on Amazon. It's on all platforms. So take a look. But thank you very much for a very thoughtful and very interesting conversation. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for listening.